Okay, it's 11:15. So welcome everyone to our Integrated Pest Management Academic Seminar Series, which is designed to increase awareness and new research and techniques that advance IPM and its adoption in all types of pest management settings. These seminars are once a month during the academic year, and you can find the upcoming seminars as well as other events like our What's Bugging You First Friday series on our website, which I just put into the chat a link for. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dan Wickstead, who is recently retired after 34 years as a pesticide safety educator, first with the pesticide applicator training program at the University of Wisconsin, and then with the Cornell pesticide safety education program. Dan served on many councils and committees, including the EPA Certification and Training Assessment Group, and has received many recognitions for his work, including the Professional Recognition Award for Risk Communication from the American Association of Pesticide Safety Educators. So thank you, Dan. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm happy to be here with you this morning. We're going to talk about basically how to communicate with people about risk and pesticides to help people be more likely to adopt IPM. And since you're on this webinar, I'm assuming you're involved in pest management or working with pesticides in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess you probably have questions about pesticides in your professional and personal lives, much like I do. It's so common EPA is even aware of it. So they added professionalism to the new pesticide applicator certification competency standards, which include for applicators how to communicate about pesticide risk with customers and the public. So it's not just university and industry specialists who are now expected to interact with the public, but applicators as well. So pretty much anyone on this call is now pretty much expected to be able to talk about the public. So first you have to ask the question, who is your public? Okay, this will depend in part on what you do for a living, but any one of these groups could be people who are paying attention to you. And it's not just people you talk to directly. If you have a website or if you put out fact sheets, any of these people could be seeing your information. So once you think about who your public is, the next question is, where are they getting their information about pesticides? Okay, as this slide shows, people often get information from bad places, and it's often not good information. Okay, and as I'll describe in a bit, the last 6 years or so have seen me get drawn deeper and deeper into the world of risk communication. Now, that would seem normal for a pesticide safety educator. But risk communication isn't just read the label and wear gloves. Okay, that's safety education. Risk communication involves explaining what risk is, how we determine what level of risk is considered acceptable, and probably most importantly, communicating risk with an understanding of how your audience might perceive risk. Okay, for example, most of the people on this webinar probably know the difference between toxicity and risk. Toxicity is simply a measure of a chemical's ability to cause harm. For example, it might be corrosive to eyes. It's a trait of the chemical itself. Risk, on the other hand, is the likelihood the chemical will cause harm. Okay, for example, even when handling that chemical as corrosive to eyes, your risk of harm will be low if you wear protective eyewear when handling it. Okay, so a key tenet of risk communication is that risk equals toxicity times exposure. And we understand that risk depends largely on the route and extent of your exposure to the toxic agent. So often exposure is the more important part of this equation. This is why you wear gloves or protective eyewear when the label tells you to, right? To reduce your exposure and therefore your risk of harm. What I've learned over 34 years is when it comes to pesticides, the public often sees pesticide risk this way. If it's toxic, it will hurt me. The exposure part of it just drops out of the equation. I'll give you an example. I received a phone call from one who was concerned. It was in May. She had ants coming into her house, which is, the time they start doing it. And she'd contacted the pest control firm to see what to do. And they managed a plan of attack. And one part of that was to do a barrier treatment of insecticide along the outside foundation of the house to help keep the ants from coming inside. And she said she was concerned because her daughter had just found out that she's pregnant, and the woman wanted to know if it would be safe for her daughter to come to Thanksgiving dinner. Okay, 6 months later, would it be safe for our daughter to come to dinner? Now, some people I've told that story to kind of laugh because, oh, obviously be safe, but to me, I'm taking it, this is a woman who's concerned about the health of her future grandchild. And I took it from that standpoint. And I talked to her about it, and I focused on exposure. I said, 6 months, the pesticide's going to break down. Also, if your daughter comes to Thanksgiving dinner, how much time is she going to have in contact with the exterior foundation of your house? And it says, yeah, she wouldn't be. So I made her feel better. She called later, said she found a dead ant in her house and was confused because she thought the barrier treatment was supposed to keep ants outside. And I explained, well, what probably happened is as the ant walked across the insecticide on the outside foundation, it managed to get in the house first before the pesticide killed it. And then she got worried because that ant had tracked insecticide into her house. Now what should she do? So I talked to her about it, explained, think of how much pesticide it might take to kill an ant, and then think of how big you are and the relative difference. So the amount of pesticide on that ant's body is likely not going to be any concern to you. And pick it up with a tissue and throw it out. And she was very grateful. In fact, she became what I call a frequent flyer. She called me several times. So where did her exaggerated sense of risk about pesticides come from? Well, part of it's innate, tied to how we perceive risk. Key research shows that these 7 factors play a key role in how people perceive risk. For example, studies show that people perceive less risk from getting an X-ray, a process in which they are directly irradiated, than from a nuclear power plant that could be hundreds of miles away from their home. Okay, why that difference? Well, it's because they choose whether or not to have an X-ray. Okay, they see a benefit from it. They're familiar with X-rays. They've been getting dental X-rays since they were a kid. And they trust the doctor or dentist who prescribes it. On the flip side, the nuclear power plant is imposed upon them. They don't see the benefit because the lights already come on when they flip the switch. So why do we need a nuclear power plant? They're not familiar with it. Okay. And they don't trust a large corporation that's looking, in their mind, looking to profit at their expense. Okay. So think of the woman I talked about. She's doesn't have a relationship with a pest control company, so they're not trusted. She's not familiar with the pesticides. She was worried about not just a child, but an unborn child. It's man-made. Okay, so all those things raised red flags for her as far as what the level of risk is. So this is one thing that affects how people perceive risk. And it's easy for people, then blame the media or legislators or Facebook for adding on to this, perceived sense of risk. But those people, legislators, people on Facebook, they often get their information from us. As I mentioned before, our fact sheets, our websites. Okay, and some of our messaging about pesticides and IPM and risk isn't great. Okay, this is something I've come to realize over the last few years that I've been invited to talk about Roundup and cancer 60 times in 13 states. And actually, next month, I'll be talking about it to an audience in Canada, where it's basically amounted to a risk communication tour. So this deep dive into risk communication got me thinking about our messaging about risk when we talk about managing pests. To the point where I submitted 2 articles about it to the Journal of Pesticide Safety Education. Both had the main title, IPM Pesticides and Risk. And the first one had the subtitle, Part 1, The Untold Story. So I'm going to start there. Okay. And keep in mind, I'm talking about exaggerated sense of risk about pesticides. We all know pesticides present hazards and there are risks associated with their use, and we teach people about that. So think about IPM. There are a lot of different definitions out there about it, but basically it's a process to successfully manage pests while minimizing economic risk. Okay, those are the 2 goals of IPM. You want to meet both of them. And because pesticides are among those options, we obviously talk about risks as well as ways to, just to manage them. So take a look at what the information about these two pest management products say. Labels, any, advertising that comes with them. Product A is for structural pest management. Product B is for non-selective vegetation management. You notice at the top of the screen, I mentioned IARC. That's the International Agency for Research on Cancer. That's the group that determined that Roundup's active ingredient, glyphosate, is a probable human carcinogen. So looking at these label warnings for these two products, you can imagine we've all relayed these hazards to people who might ask us about using these products for pest management, right? And it's more than plausible that a state legislature would ban the use of this potentially cancer-causing non-selective vegetation management product on state land, right? Well, no, because these products aren't pesticides. So no worries, perfectly safe. At least that's the messaging the public hears. Okay, every extension publication I've seen that talks about pesticides talks about reading the label, be careful, mentions hazards and risk. You have never seen that mentioned about using silicone sealant in extended publications that talk about caulking around windows and doors to keep ants out of the house. So just think about this for a minute. If you're spraying a pesticide around your house and you get some on your hands, what do you do right away? You stop spraying and wash your hands, right? And if the cuff, even if the cuff of the shirt gets wet, you take it off and put on a new one before continuing, right? So be honest with yourself. Do your work jeans end up looking like this after you caulk around windows at home? Did. So admit it, when you get caulk in your hands, you just wipe on your work clothes and keep working. You might even use your finger to smooth the caulk along, the bead of caulk along where you put it, right? Why the difference? Simply put, the proper response to caulk exposure is not ingrained in you, as is the proper response to pesticide exposure. And likewise, it's not ingrained in the public's perception because we never talk about it. In public settings, we pretty much talk about risk associated with management only when discussing pesticide options. When I say we, I'm including this guy right here, okay? So my musings are intended to generate thought, discussion, and progress rather than any feelings of defensiveness or that I'm thinking you're a bad person or anything, okay? A good friend of mine said that if you look back upon your past self and don't cringe a little, you haven't grown. I love that statement. So these articles I wrote and what I'm talking about today are my attempt to help us grow and improve adoption of IPM. But why? Why after 30 years as a pesticide safety educator am I on a mission to get people to talk about the risk associated with non-chemical control options? Because I realize that the messaging from academia and industry alike is inconsistent with and often contradicts IPM itself, especially with respect to minimizing risk. Okay, so I want to talk about why we need to broaden our discussion of risk within IPM and change our messaging. Simply put, to develop an IPM plan that minimizes risk, you have to assess and compare the risk associated with all the management options being considered. If you're doing 6 or 7 things to control a pest problem and only one of them is pesticides, and that's the only one where you're considering the risk involved, how do you know you're minimizing risk? You haven't looked at everything. So when a pest management professional shows up to a house and sees this bald-faced hornet nest 26 feet up in the air, I'm quite certain they're weighing the risk of climbing a ladder to scrape that nest off versus using a wasp spray from the ground, right? They have to look at all the risk involved. And then to minimize risk when actually implementing the IPM plan, we must be aware of and communicate all the risks and how to mitigate them. So going back to that person who's trying to take care of that bald-faced hornet nest, if they're going to climb a ladder and deal with it, they're going to wear a bee suit. They're going to have training in ladder safety. They're going to maybe have someone holding the ladder at the ground level to help it stay steady, right? Or are they communicating those risks to the customer? All the customer is thinking about is if you use a wasp spray, some of it might drip down onto my, yard room. My kids are playing, some might get in the window. And that's probably all that the pest management professional is talking to the customer about as well. Another reason to broaden our discussion is when dealing with the public, discounting the risk of non-chemical methods exaggerates perceived risks associated with pesticides. Okay, this silence implies there's zero risk from non-chemical control methods, which therefore gives the impression that pesticides pose infinitely more risk, because anything is infinitely more than zero, right? That's simple math. And so if pesticides pose infinitely more risk, they're therefore downright dangerous. And here's one result of that. This is real. The University of Alabama Birmingham Police Department, and they're not the only one, was telling employees to use wasp spray to stop an active shooter on campus. This article, the author is saying it can spray the neurotoxin 25 feet, blinding them when it gets in their eyes. Well, first of all, if you've ever used one of these products when standing 20 feet or so from a nest, you know your first shot is wide of the target and you have to redirect a little bit, right? Active shooter is not going to give you that second chance, okay? But more to the point, if you look at the label of these sprays that, shoot a wasp spray 25 feet, they're not even so much as mildly irritating to the eyes. They don't harm the eyes at all. So wasp spray would be no more effective than a super soaker, right? But here we have a police department believing they are very potent weapons that can blind someone on contact. Why? Because they're pesticides. Finally, implying a lack of risk for non-chemical options gives a false sense of safety that makes risky behavior and poor decision-making more likely. It was an occasion dealing with this last point that really got me thinking about all this. I think it was 2019 or so. I was in an EPA conference in Washington State. Some pesticide regulators from the State Department of Ag were there and heard my glyphosate presentation. Then as part of the workshop, we visited a forestry site managed by a large paper company. And the foresters said they were getting pressure from advocacy groups and the state legislature to stop using glyphosate to control woody brush and resprouts. Someone asked, what was being suggested to be used instead. He said chainsaws. So I asked if he could speak to any risks associated with that. And he did. He spoke at great length. And afterward, he came up to me. I'll never forget this. He shook my hand and said, I want to thank you for asking that question. No one ever asked about the risks associated with non-chemical control options. So here's a case where people in the industry knew about the risk of using chainsaws, but their public did not. Okay, I'm sure the same is true for you in some instances. So the Washington State regulators heard that exchange too and invited me to give my presentation again, this time at a state Senate task force on herbicide use in forestry. So I did a bit more research into the chainsaw issue. And among a few of my findings, timber industry has the highest percent of hearing loss. Cuts from chainsaws are the top cause of hospitalization in the industry. Engine exhaust is a possible human carcinogen, as it is with string trimmers, and you can't wear a respirator because there's too much vibration using a chainsaw. So you can get illness from inhaling the chemicals. And globally, about 30 million gallons of chain oil are released into the environment annually from forestry operations. And that oil has adverse effects on all parts of our ecosystem. And I found this great statement from the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, who are researching the same issue and made this statement about using power tools instead of herbicides. I'm going to read it to you. It says, if manual brush control of power tools is to be used, the ethical and policy implications of the potential accompanying health risk must be given close attention. Such policy decisions must include an objective and thorough examination of the risk for each option. I would like to apply this concept to every pest management situation and obviously add environmental risks as well as health. So this experience really led me to break from the pack and from my own history to not only start talking more about the hazards and risks of non-chemical control options, but to encourage my colleagues to do so as well. And doing so is consistent with what we already preach. Okay, we already tell people IPM minimizes risk in managing pests. We have to assess risk fully for that to happen. We tell people to consider using a pesticide if the benefits outweigh the risk. And sometimes one benefit is that the alternative poses even more risk than the pesticide. Okay. So I'm not suggesting any shift in what we're trying to achieve. In fact, I think rather than shifting the goals of IPM, a broader discussion of risk will help us better achieve the goals of IPM and will help your public understand why pesticides might be used. Okay, so here's an example of how I've changed my messaging. In our manual here in New York State for right-of-way herbicide applicators that they study in order to get become certified applicators, we have chapters on hazards associated with pesticide use, pesticide overspray and drift, protecting water from pesticide contamination, and the chapters on managing vegetation and utility right-of-ways, railways, and roadsides. We talk about the risks from using herbicides in those venues, right? But in the entire manual, concern about non-chemical options is limited to one sentence in one chapter. Hand mowing weeds under guide rails is dangerous to workers as well as time-consuming and expensive. So what I started doing in my glyphosate presentations, because I already talked about chemical alternatives to glyphosate because people want to know about that, I started talking about non-chemical options as well. And I use string trimmers along roadsides as an option. And I talked about the hazards and risks associated with that use. And here are some of them. They're loud. There's risk of hearing loss. The vibration can cause nerve damage, especially in people who have circulatory issues. The whipping action can throw rocks 50 feet. Okay, there was actually one utility in New York State where they switched to string trimmers on the roadside, ended up throwing a rock through a windshield of an oncoming car. And those hazards and risks are listed right in the manual of a string trimmer I have hanging up in my garage, okay? Engine exhaust, again, possibly human carcinogen. And think about plastic pollution. Anyone who's used a string trimmer for any length of time knows they have to go to the store and get a replacement spool of string. Why? Because that plastic string breaks up as it's being used to cut weeds, ends up in small little pieces. So on a roadside, that's going to wash down into a drainage ditch, which eventually leads to surface water, which eventually leads to the ocean. And if you just Google plastic pollution in the ocean, it's not a pretty sight. Then there's the issue of traffic. If you're applying a pesticide along guide rails on a roadside, you're in a truck applying it and you're going past it fairly quickly. If you're using a string trimmer, you're in the shoulder for a longer amount of time, doing it more often because it doesn't go down to the roots. So the weed grows back. So there's an increased risk of workers getting struck by vehicles. But not only that, when I was talking to the DOT official about this, I said, okay, so that's why you have people, you close a lane and say, right lane closed ahead, merge left. The person told me, yeah, but in that case, when you have those changes in traffic patterns, vehicle accidents become more likely. Okay, so regardless of what the workers are doing on the roadside, whether they're using a string trimmer, painting a guardrail, or just taking a break, making motorists change their traffic patterns increases the likelihood of accidents. So what the person told me from the DOT is that worker and motorist safety was the number one reason they had an herbicide program in the first place. Okay. Now you can say, okay, DOT workers already know this, so why bring it up? Well, the reason is not just DOT workers who are seeing my glyphosate presentations. My public includes all these people. Okay. Many of whom not only influence public opinion, but might have a direct hand in drafting legislation and regulations about pesticides. Okay, these are the same people who read what you post on your websites. Where else do they hear information about non-chemical pest control risks than from us? I mean, imagine if the public knew the DOT was using herbicides to protect them. Not to save money, not because they're lazy, but to protect them. Why aren't we telling them that? And why didn't I start talking about this? Because I'd already given the glyphosate presentation about 20 times to over 1,000 people. Okay, I had to change what I was doing. Because the fact is, if we don't publicly talk about risks from non-chemical options. Others will spread our faulty message that only pesticides pose any risk. And that's going to make it less likely people are going to find the approach that poses the least risk, which is what we want them to do in IPM. So expanding our discussion of risk is the easy part. Changing our messaging, that's a little harder and takes more work. And this was the subject of the second paper, part 2, Conquering the Contradiction Conundrum. So going back to our goals of IPM, to successfully manage pests and while minimizing risk, we have myriad ways to successfully manage any given pest situation. There's always more than one way to do it. But of all the approaches we can take, only one also satisfies the second goal here, because minimize is an absolute, right? Some approaches will present less risk than others, but only one presents the least risk. So let's imagine we found two approaches, Plan A and Plan B, that will solve the pest problem equally well. It doesn't matter what the pest problem is, make one up in your head. But Plan A and Plan B solve the problem equally well. Of all the plans out there, Plan A poses least risk, which means that Plan B poses more risk, okay? Which one do we want people to use, Plan A or Plan B? It's not a trick question. We're going to go with Plan A, right? Controls the pest with the least risk. And since Plan A does manage the problem equally well but with less risk, you'd recommend it even if it uses pesticides that are more toxic than those used in Plan B. So why do we keep telling the public to use the least toxic pesticide? Remember, toxicity is only one part of the risk equation and often less critical than the exposure component. Okay? We're after least risk, not least toxic. And saying use the least toxic pesticide actually contradicts business practice. Okay, sometimes fumigation is warranted. Those are not the least toxic chemicals out there, but sometimes they're warranted. And from a public standpoint, if you give this advice to use least toxic pesticide, I'm not sure they could follow that advice. Here's an example. These are label statements from the first 5 products that popped up when I did a search in our state's pesticide database for products a person can use to control Japanese beetle adults on rhubarb. I would challenge you to spend time and tell me which of these is least toxic. They all have the same signal word, which is caution, which means it's slightly toxic to relatively non-toxic. Let's just look at products A and B. You might think B is more toxic because you have to wait a day before you can eat the rhubarb, whereas the other product, you can spray and eat it the same day. But then look at the precautionary statements. Product A is harmful if swallowed. Product B is maybe harmful if swallowed. Sounds like product A is more toxic. And with any combination you look at, you can pick one as being least toxic, and I'll tell you another one is. Okay, so if you give that advice to someone and they go out to a store and they look for a product, and this is what they're up against, you've lost trust. They're not going to call you back on a Thursday night. They're going to ask the nice person in an orange vest which product they should use, and they'll probably get bad advice there because that person doesn't know any more than they do. And if you tell a customer, if you're a professional advocate, you tell a customer, we're going to use the least toxic pesticide, and you tell them what they're using, they're going to go online and find one they think is less toxic still. Okay, and quite often toxicity depends on the situation. Here's a statement from a turf insecticide label. It says it's extremely toxic to aquatic organisms. Don't allow the pesticide to enter or run off into storm drains, drainage ditches, gutters, or surface waters. Okay. So look at this view from a house my brother and I own on a small lake in upstate, northern New York. Okay. We have a lawn that slopes right down and doesn't end until it's at the lake. We're at the bottom of a hill. When it rains, we literally see streams of water running down our lawn into that lake. I would never use a product that says it's extremely toxic to aquatic organisms here, okay? I would never do it. Looking at my home in the Finger Lakes, my front yard, there's no nearby surface water. Looking from the other view from the house, you do see a road off in the distance, which means there's a drainage ditch, but there's 50 feet of woods between our lawn and that roadside ditch. We have piles of leaves and needles and branches that have accumulated over the years. I'm pretty sure I could use this product on my front lawn with virtually as close to zero as possible exposure to aquatic organisms. But if a landscape company came to me and said, okay, we're going to solve your problem, we've come up with a method that will do it well with the least risk, and I see them using this product, and I've been told to use the least toxic pesticide, I'm going to say, no, use a different product, which will end up steering the company away from the plan that poses least risk. That's not IPM. So since plan A poses the least risk, you'd still recommend it, even if it calls for applying pesticide upon diagnosis of the problem. The public hears us saying use pesticides as a last resort and use pesticides only after all other management options have failed. Okay. What are the problems with this? Well, let's think about how people perceive this messaging. Think about that term last resort. What would you consider a last resort if you're pecked out loose and was hit by a car and seriously injured? Or your coworker's arm was badly injured or mangled by equipment you were operating? Or you have a business, you have 4 long-term employees, but need to find a way to drastically cut costs to stay competitive. If you had to go with the last resort in these situations, is your reaction going to be, yay, I solved the problem? Or I feel so guilty, how could I have let this happen? The latter, right? Is that the way you want people to feel if they've used a pesticide to control a pest with the least risk? Okay, it's just really bad messaging. And my daughter really brought this home. My daughter Ellen is the best science communicator I've ever come across. She got a PhD in neuroscience. She's working for a NASA program right now at the University of Vermont. And when I was talking about these papers with her, and I mentioned this phrasing about using, pesticides as a last resort, she immediately said, never say last resort. I mean, if you have bed bugs, the last resort isn't a pesticide, it's to burn down the house. Okay? Pesticides are not the last resort. And what about the phrasing about use only after all other methods have failed? Well, looking through extension publications, I found 6 non-chemical approaches for managing cockroaches in the home. So if I'm told to use pesticides only after all these methods have failed, do I have to try all 6 or different combinations? Because there's 63 possible combinations for using one or more method, and there's 720 ways to shuffle the order in which you implement all 6. Okay, that's fun with math. And for how long do I have to try each combination before I decide they failed? And what constitutes failure? Do we tell homeowners what constitutes a failure? We really don't. Okay. Telling people to use pesticides only after all of the methods have failed is virtually useless advice. It basically means never use the pesticide. And it makes someone feel like they've failed if they resort to using a product. And it contradicts what's done in practice. Let me give you an example. Dr. Kobi Shah at NC State wrote a recent article in Pest Management Professional magazine where he talked about turning IPM upside down. It was about dealing with cockroaches in multifamily housing, apartment complexes, okay? He said, we've long observed the integrated pest management pyramid. At the bottom, you start with cultural and sanitation practices, you move to physical and mechanical control, then biological and genetic control, and finally, pesticides are only used in a judicious and targeted manner as needed, right? You're going from prevention up to management. But he showed data that in heavily infested cockroach accounts in multifamily housing, the best approach is actually to start with insecticide baits to knock down the population and then institute physical and sanitation controls. So he turned the pyramid upside down, start with pest elimination. Okay, it's a very good article based on science, but I have to disagree with Dr. Shah in one respect. His approach does not turn IPM on its head because his approach was IPM. It successfully managed the pest with the least risk, including reducing the risk to people's health because cockroaches, they produce allergens and they carry multiple disease-causing bacteria and viruses, okay? So rather than turning IPM itself on its head, what he did is turn a common misconception about IPM on its head. The notion that IPM means using pesticides only after all other methods have failed. Okay. If you look at the pyramid on the left, It makes sense if you're starting from scratch. I am going to open a restaurant. I have a vacant lot. I'm going to build the restaurant from scratch. I'm going to landscape the property from scratch. Then I'm starting from the bottom of the pyramid. Most of us don't start from the bottom. We walk into a situation where there's a pest problem. We have to deal with that problem. A farmer is planting their crop into soil that has an existing weed seed bank. They're not starting from scratch. They are planting into a problem. Okay. You can't walk into any pest management situation and decide up front, I'm going to use pesticides last. Every situation is different. Okay. IPM is about successfully managing a pest with the least risk, whether that involves pesticides, good old foot stomping, or wizardry. It doesn't matter. So going back to our two possible plans, you'd still recommend plan A, even if it uses more pesticide than plan B. We keep telling the public one goal of IPM is to reduce the amount of pesticide used. Again, this can steer someone away from the best approach. What if that apartment manager said to Dr. Shaw, well, no, IPM means using less pesticides. You're not going to come here and start with bait. I want you to start with having people clean up their kitchens. Okay. That would result in going away from IPM, doing a worse job of controlling the pest, putting people at more risk. Okay. You can't tell walking into a situation whether you're going to increase or decrease the use of pesticides. It depends on what's been done before and what the situation is. And then there's this statement. It doesn't necessarily contradict IPM the way others do. Okay, and it seems to make sense. I mean, why use anything if it's not necessary? But do we explain how to determine when something is necessary, when a pesticide is necessary? We might with production agriculture, where we have economic thresholds, but certainly not in structural pest control, food processing, pest management, landscape pest control. And necessary is very subjective. Okay, my brother, the accountant, has a very different view on a bald-faced hornet nest that's 15 feet up in a tree in his yard. I'm thinking, leave it be. They're doing you favors. He's like, I want them dead, right? Necessary is very subjective. And then name one other IPM approach ever used to fill in this blank. Use blank only when necessary. Think of a farmer who's planting in the spring. They're waiting for the soil to warm up. They don't want to plant into waterlogged soil. They're going to plant their seed at the proper depth. They're going to plant the proper seed density per acre. And all of that helps ensure the seed will germinate rapidly and help avoid seedling, seed rot, seedling blight, damping off, all those things, right? Now imagine an extension educator telling them, use proper planting practices only when necessary. Or a consultant walking into a food processing facility and say, use sanitation only when necessary. Does that make any sense? I mean, it's laughable. So as with ignoring the risk of non-chemical options, using this statement only for pesticides sends a message that anything is safer than using a pesticide. So what are the consequences of this messaging I've talked about? Well, the first is irrational fear of pesticides. It skews the ability to assess relative risk. And again, I'm talking about irrational or exaggerated fear of pesticides. I'm a pesticide safety educator. I know they pose risk. I teach about the risk they pose. I'm talking about this exaggerated sense of risk. Okay. And for this consequence, I think Gary Larson summed it up best. Gary Larson puts together The Far Side, one of my favorite comic strips. And this is one about pesticide residues. Here's Eve in the Garden of Eden, holding the apple. And the serpent is saying, well, I'm not sure. I guess it's been washed, right? She's already feeling okay with incurring the wrath of God by eating that apple, but she's not so sure about pesticide residues. Okay, that's kind of a skewed risk assessment, right? I thought this was a brilliant cartoon. But bringing it into, out of the cartoon world, when I talk about pesticides to the public, I often start with just what is a pesticide, because the public thinks it's only insecticides. So I put up a slide like this one time and asked people, which of these products are pesticides. And a woman in the audience was very surprised to find out that disinfectants are pesticides. So she said to me, she asked, "So are you telling me we shouldn't use them?" And I'm like, "No, please, by all means, for the sake of your family, keep cleaning your bathroom." The fact that she found out that Lysol or bleach was a pesticide, she was immediately willing to accept the risk of all those disease-causing bacteria and viruses that these products help kill. Okay. Another consequence is misinformed decisions leading to higher risk behaviors. A woman I know well admits to a certain daily hair, skin, and body care regimen. And I've had no luck changing her habits, okay? Just casual conversations, but we talk about it. So starts in the shower in the morning, shampoo, store-bought synthetic, conditioner, store-bought synthetic, body wash, soap, deodorant, makeup, even sunscreen, store-bought synthetic. Bug repellent, homemade and all natural. Okay, why? And note she's in an area where Lyme disease and West Nile virus are present. This isn't chemophobia, okay? This person is clearly not afraid of chemicals. This is pesticidophobia. Where did it come from? Okay, some is from the media, but our messaging, phrases like use pesticides as a last resort, and others I've mentioned, feeds and reinforces inaccurate media story about pesticides and this exaggerated sense of fear about them. Another consequence is preference for any alternative, even if ludicrous. Excuse me. Probably remember a few years ago when Zika was first detected in the United States. Zika is a disease caused by a virus that's transmitted by mosquitoes. People are obviously concerned about this. And one township in New York State decided they were going to tackle the problem. So they were using funds from the township, taxpayer money, to put up bat houses on public lands. And they enlisted the help of Boy Scouts to go around and teach homeowners how to put up bat houses on their own property. And the New York Times covered this with a headline, "Devouring 1,000 mosquitoes an hour, bats are now welcome guests as Zika fears rise." And they had a quote from the town supervisor that said, "Bats can eat up to 1,000 mosquitoes per hour. No pesticide can do that." Well, let's look at this for a minute. First of all, bats don't eat up to 1,000 mosquitoes per hour. That's not just an urban legend, that's an exaggeration of an urban legend. Fact is, mosquitoes make up about less than 1% of a bat's diet. And this makes sense if you think about it from the bat's perspective. You're a bat flying around at night, and your sonar tells you you're queuing in on a mosquito that's that big or a moth that's that big. Which are you going for? Okay, if you think people are the ones that came up with the idea of supersizing their meals, you're wrong. Bats have been doing it for millions of years. So first of all, bats don't eat that many mosquitoes. Second, the mosquitoes that transmit Zika or are capable of transmitting Zika fly and bite during the day. Okay? If your township has hordes of bats flying around in the middle of the afternoon, maybe Zika is no longer your number one public health concern. Okay? Maybe you want to get the Boy Scouts going around town telling people how to take down their bat houses, right? It's a totally nonsensical method of mosquito control. And of course, she said, no pesticides can do that, but yeah, a pesticide application timed well and placed well can certainly kill more than 1,000 mosquitoes in an hour. So if this woman wasn't afraid of pesticides, she could have gone to local pest control companies and said, "What should we do?" And they would likely tell her, "Where pesticides aren't going to do it. What you want to do is teach people how to reduce habitat. Empty their bird baths weekly and dry them out. Okay, don't leave dog bowls out full of water forever. Okay, clean your gutters. There's no standing water, things like that." Another consequence is home remedies. You see these everywhere, easy to find online in newspapers, even extension publications. And the people promoting them are often, well-intentioned. They'll make claims like chemical-free, pesticide-free, non-toxic, all-natural, effective, and safe. And in reality, everything is made of chemicals. A chemical that controls pests is a pesticide, whether you buy in a store or mix it up in your bathtub. Okay, generally chemicals have to be toxic to kill things, right? As far as all natural goes, most use man-made products like vinegar, dish soap, hydrogen peroxide, things like that. And the effectiveness and safety are untested. In fact, they're demonstrably shown to be unsafe in many cases. Classic examples, you see people wanting to use vinegar to control weeds. There are registered herbicides that contain acetic acid as the active ingredient. Acetic acid is what's in vinegar. And the signal word on those products is danger because it's corrosive to eyes. And it tells you, those labels tell you to wear goggles or protective eyewear when you're applying that pesticide. I've yet to see any do-it-yourself site on the internet recommending the use of vinegar to control weeds, telling people to wear protective eyewear. Okay. And the other issue is loss of trust. If you tell someone to go out and try to find the least toxic pesticide and they find out there is no such thing, or you tell them you're going to use the least toxic pesticide and they come up with several that they think are less toxic than what you're planning to use, you've lost trust. Okay, remember these personal outrage factors. Again, looking back at that woman who called me about concern about the ant control product, again, man-made. She was worried about a child. She's not familiar with an untrusted entity, all those kinds of things. If you don't earn their trust, you're going to lose them quickly. So this is why I say we're starting behind the eight ball when we talk to people about pesticides. If our messaging contradicts our intended message, we lose their trust. And they're not going to be willing to hear what we have to say. I will tell you right now, that glyphosate presentation I've given 60 times, soon to be 61, I think the reason I was asked to give it so many times is I spend, it's a 50-minute long presentation. I spend about the first 10 minutes overcoming these barriers. Not even really talking about glyphosate, just overcoming these barriers to get people to listen to what I have to say. So moving forward, what do we do? Well, first, talk about the hazards and risks associated with any pest management option you present to people. There is a risk associated with this. When I started doing it, people were thinking I was doing it to try to cover up the risk posed by pesticides or to make the risk posed by pesticides seem not so bad, right? What I'm really trying to do is just avoid this exaggerated, avoid the exaggerated sense of pesticides so people can make a good decision about pest management, but also to make sure that when they do decide how to control a pest, they're thinking of all these different risks and which combination of approaches will actually minimize risk. Again, if you're only thinking about risk associated with pesticides and not with climbing up a ladder or using a string trimmer on a roadside, if you're discounting all those risks, you are not doing IPM because you're ignoring that second goal of IPM, which is to reduce risk. So yeah, some people accuse me of being pro-pesticide when I start talking about these other risks. I assured them, no, I'm not. Read my manuals. There's chapters and chapters about the risk posed by pesticides and what you have to do to protect yourself and others. I just want to talk about these other ones as well. So as you move forward, stop using these statements. Okay, use least toxic pesticide, use pesticides only as a last resort, only when other options have failed. The goal of IPM is to reduce the use of pesticides and use pesticides only when necessary. I've given you examples in each of these cases how that could actually drive a person away from selecting or accepting the approach that successfully controls the pest with the least risk. In other words, driving people away from IPM, which is not what we want to do. Okay, so the final thought, messaging matters. What we say and what we don't say, and how people might interpret what we say and don't say matters. So let's think about our messaging. With that, thank you. I have retired from Cornell, but I get to keep my my email. I do check it every now and then. So if you have any thoughts about, I've talked about, any questions about it, or if you think there's other groups that might benefit from hearing it, let me know. I do check this, occasionally, and I will get back to you. So with that, thank you. And
Thank